Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this to another level.
And let me just share my screen as well for anyone who hasn't been able to get onto the board. I think I can't share screen, so we'll just have to go with whoever's on the board. There seems to be a whiteboard sharing that's preventing me from sharing my screen myself. So in general, people are saying retrospectives are magical, they're more light bulb moments, they're more powerful. Not so many people feeling it's the opposite side of that. And what about some comments? So they are the most important teams for things to have. I fully agree. They are magical to team development. They are uncomfortable, absolutely, but rewarding. They are the best way to look back and make changes. They can be repetitive. Yeah, very much so. They can be repetitive. They are an opportunity for teams to improve and discuss what happens. They are a problem-solving opportunity. They're a team bonding opportunity and a learning opportunity. All very, very true. Right, what I'd like to do now, when I grew up in an era where my favorite books and video games were ones where you could choose your own adventure, like I was playing a role. And I like to do the same when I'm delivering talks. So I would like you to help me by telling me where you'd like to focus. I want you to choose your own adventure. So your options for how we take this talk, and I could deliver this talk 50 times and it could be delivered 50 different ways. I want you to use the little post-it notes once more and share where you would like to focus first. Your options are the foundations for continuous improvement, facilitation tips and tricks, retrospective formats, and finishing up, that all important part at the end of the retro where you convert those insights generated into tangible actions. The one that gets the most votes is where we'll start, and we will use the 45 minutes that we have to cover as many tips and tricks as I can share with you. It's looking like facilitation is taking a storming lead so far. I'm not sure that lead is going to be changed. No, facilitation is clear. Right, so folks, we're going to start with facilitation. I'm going to bring everyone's attention to here on the board. My first thing for you is a question, actually. How does silence feel to you during a retrospective? Again, we've got a bit of a duality line. On the left-hand side, it's so uncomfortable. On the right-hand side, I've got this. How does it feel from your perspective? Where does silence sit in your scale?
Apologies to interrupt. Can somebody share the Miro link? I think a couple of us don't have it. Thank you.
I've just shared the Miro link once more in the chat.
Thank you.
Right, so it's very split. There's lots of you that feel uncomfortable. There's some of you that have got this. It's a huge mix. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, folks. When I've facilitated hundreds of retrospectives now, facilitated hundreds of meetings, silence to me used to be an awful thing. It was like a deafening noise. I thought, oh my God, I'm asking the wrong questions. I'm not facilitating well enough. People are bored. It felt really uncomfortable. Now, what I've learned since is that silence isn't necessarily a bad thing. People process information in different ways. I'm someone who likes to talk to think, whereas some people like to think before responding. They like to deliberate. They like to take time to respond before sharing. So something I recommend you try is embracing silence. Something you can do is when you've put a question out there in a retro, when you've asked a prompt, when you're trying to get people thinking, don't be tempted to punctuate that silence with your own thoughts. Because if you do that, you may steer the direction of that conversation towards your own bias rather than what the team needs. The power of the pause, Jenny says, absolutely. A pause is very powerful. It's why the FBI and things like that, and companies like that use pauses as a way of interrogating people, because silence can be very powerful. People feel compelled to fill that silence. So if you just sit there and wait for a few moments, longer than you initially think, people will start talking again. They'll fill the silence themselves. They'll have more thoughts and ideas. Another way that you can really embrace silence in retrospectives is by trying a silence retrospective format. So what you can do there is you can essentially basically do a retrospective where no one speaks at all. So you get a virtual whiteboard, you let people know the rules, so there's no talking. And one of the benefits of this is it really forces people to focus, because if you can't hear one another, you have to focus on what they're writing on the board. So imagine a situation where you've got your prompts up there, people are adding their thoughts. If you need to clarify something, you type another post-it note next to it, perhaps in a different color, to highlight there's a question, and it forces you to focus, which obviously we know in a very geographically distributed world with lots of things going on and notification overloads, sometimes focusing can be very difficult, especially if you've got a long retrospective. So there is a video that you can jump onto if you double click this section here, where you've got the Three Little Pigs retrospective. There's a YouTube video where Dov Sal, who showed me and introduced me to this retrospective template, talks through it in more detail. So basically the principles are no speaking, you go with the flow, respect one another, and it enables focus and embracing silence as an approach. So there's one thing you can try. Now, the next one I'm going to share with you is probably very contrary to what many of you will expect from me, given that I'm such a proponent of creating new retrospective templates and using themes and different ways of doing things. So something you can try doing is fixing the format. So many of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the standard start, stop, continue, or sad, mad, glad, those sorts of retrospectives that some people I think alluded to earlier can be a bit repetitive. But the important thing is, does it work for the team? And if it works for the team and the team are getting actionable improvements each time, and it's resulting in them then improving, then it doesn't matter necessarily what the format they're using. So often the approach that's best is the one that works for the team, their situation, their culture. It may be very pertinent to stick to a consistent format, especially if you've got a brand new team, they're just starting retrospecting, and they're just getting used to the process. There's no need to confuse things or complicate things by having lots of different types of formats. Sometimes simplicity is key. We all say, keep it simple, stupid. Try fixing the formats if that works for your team. Now, the flip side of that is flexing the format. And this is probably the one that I'm most known for. I love me a good retrospective format. I've created 82 now, I think, and shared them with the world. Everything from Queen the Rock Band, Squid Games, dog memes, made an American football one last week. If you have an idea for my retrospective backlog, type it in the chat, I'll add it to my backlog. I'm sure it will get created sometime in the future. So chuck those out there. They're all. The reason that I do this, the reason I create different formats is because it keeps things fresh. One of the favorite stories and anecdotes I have, a Yellowstone retrospective. I've actually been to Yellowstone, so I think I can do that. One of my favorite stories and anecdotes from creating new retrospective formats, and I referenced it a little bit earlier, I was talking about Queen the Rock Band and how instead of asking what should we continue doing as a team, you could be playing the music and the song Don't Stop Me Now in the background. So don't stop me now, what should we continue doing as a team? What's going great for us? Someone I know did that Queen retrospective with a group of people, a team, and a program manager was part of that team, and he was a very serious, of a certain era, work was very work for him, never cracked a smile. And they did this retrospective, and he admitted that he loved Queen, he smiled, he engaged with the team more than he ever had on a personal level. And it was just this beautiful example of how a retrospective can result in an improvement to the team's relationship, their dynamic and bonding. So yeah, there are so many formats out there. There is a gentleman called Dave Westgarth on LinkedIn I recommend you look at. I think he's created about 50 different retrospective formats. Stephen Sampson Jones, you could jump on the Miroverse. There's a bunch of them out there as well. There is no shortage of retrospective templates out there for you to keep things fresh. I personally aspire to do a fresh new template every time I work with a team, unless of course they need a fixed one and that's going to work for them. But because there's so many out there nowadays, if you have a single team, you've probably got available to you a fresh new template that could keep you going for 10 plus years. So I encourage you, flex the format. The reason we do so, it keeps things fresh, it keeps teams engaged, they end up looking forward to retrospectives, not dreading them, and it can result in fresh new insights, things that didn't come about if you kept with a consistent format. Now, The next one I'm going to recommend is, excuse my French, fuck the format. Let me tell you a story. I once worked with quite a senior team. I was trying to help them find some ways of improving, and I brought with them, I thought I'm going to bring a fresh new template to them. I tried to use my back to the future perspective, so I was trying to encourage them to think forward into the future rather than just respecting into the past. You know, what would a headline say about us in a few months time? What does success look like for us? And it just wasn't working. The audience wasn't resonating with it. And rather than sticking to my guns and trying to force it, I just said, right, let's push the format aside. Let's just have an open and honest conversation about the most important thing we need to improve upon. Now, initially, my head was going to this is going awfully, this is a failure, this is miserable. But the fact that I just pivoted towards, right, open, honest conversation, let's move the format aside, it ended up being one of their better retrospectives that I've ever been involved with, because it was just frank, open, honest, a conversation about the important things that team needed. So don't be afraid to adjust your plan. I know it can be disheartening to come to a retrospective, to come to a meeting with grand ideas and having prepared and otherwise, and it doesn't land. Don't worry about that. It's not necessarily your own needs that you need to satisfy, it's the needs of the team in the situation. And obviously the Agile Manifesto itself talks about responding to change rather than following your own plans. Last one, or not last one, but another one I recommend is Facilitator Flux. Now I'm keen to hear, has anyone done this before? Rather than having a single person always facilitate retrospectives, has anyone tried rotating the person that does that? You can share out loud, you can nod, you can type in the chat. Anyone done this? I can see Jane's got the hand up, Obafemi, yep, Nancy. Brilliant. So people have tried this, but why do we do it? Well, one of the reasons we do that is to reduce the dependency on an individual facilitator. So if a Scrum Master isn't there, and then the team are doing it on a rotational basis, what you're doing is you're bringing in new styles, new approaches, new energy. You know, it can become less of a burden for the single person to do the retrospectives all the time, but equally and most importantly, it can build a collective skill for facilitating continuous improvement into the team. So it will reduce that dependency on an individual person to do so. It can make it a collective responsibility to continuously improve. And I have found that works really well. So one of the things that you can do is offer, or ask your team to say, right, who would like to try and facilitate a future retrospective? And try and make it a rotational basis. So one person does it 1 week, another person does it a few weeks later, but offer them support in doing so. So you could help them by sharing some of my templates if you wanted to. You could help them create their own retrospective. You could be on standby to kind of be a secondary facilitator to make sure they've got it covered. There's lots of ways of doing that. But again, what it does is it reduces the dependency on an individual person like a Scrum Master or an Agile coach, and therefore builds a collective skill and responsibility into the team for continuous improvement. And yes, it can give insight into the team's maturity or continuous improvement journey. I was just reading, sorry, one of the comments there. So how do we get introverted engineers to facilitate when they don't even want to be on camera? Well, I find when you invite people to be part of change rather than inflict it upon them, then they are there's less likely to be resistance. So if we're posing the question to the team, how could we build a collective skill for retrospective or retrospection or continuous improvement into this team? And we could talk about retrospectives are one way of doing that, having more people involved in doing that, and making sure they provided the right support in doing so. They're not going to be perfect the first time. It will be predicated on a level of safety to fail and make mistakes. And there's some plays that I'll talk about, some examples of how to do that a bit later. But yeah, you've just got to try and create the environment and provide the support they need to be able to do that. And continuity, I recommend there's an approach you can use called the timeline approach, where a team visualizes its progress over time on a timeline. So over sprint by sprint or week by week or month by month, however you want to do that, but showing on there, retrospectives that happened, maybe improvements that have happened, any key results and things like that. Visualizing your progress over time can help with a sense of continuity. And again, having team agreements in place where you establish what good looks like as a team, can really help with continuity. So if we are saying before we experiment with the notion of rotating the facilitator, that, hey, we're doing this for a purpose, it's to build in the skill set of retrospection and continuous improvement into the team, what does good look like from that? And yeah, someone's mentioned having the backlog and part of the sprint goal. If you want to reduce the dependency on one person, I personally have a value of mine, which is I exist to make myself redundant. I want to remove myself from the equation as much as possible. I want to leave a team in a better state than when I joined it. And by building skills to facilitate continuous improvement without me, that's one of my own measures of success. But if you define with a team what their success looks like, that can be a good way to get that buy-in. Right, moving on to the next one. So, polar bears. What's the age-old polar bear question that everyone, the joke, the dad joke that everyone's heard of? Jenny's shaking her head. How much does a polar bear weigh, Jenny? Enough to break the ice. Enough to break the ice. Yeah. So breaking the ice is a fantastic way to build a sense of community in a team. I always ensure that every retrospective, almost every meeting I have, has an element of icebreakers, an element of personal interaction outside of just work talk. Because what I hate, and this is coming from someone who's a people first advocate, I hate the notion that we are just avatars behind a screen. We're beating hearts behind our laptops with personal beliefs and preferences and passions and desires. And I'd rather know people on a personal level than otherwise. So by having icebreakers built into how I facilitate, how I work, it's resulted in a bonding on a level that I wouldn't have been there, or would have taken a lot longer to establish otherwise. I'll give you another example. So I was working with a team that was based in Mexico. All of them were Mexican. I was living in the UK, and I started to introduce icebreakers into their daily stand-up, just as a way of just building a bit of bonding. Now, two people in that team who had been living in the same city, had been working together for about a year and a half, discovered through doing one of these icebreakers that they both played the same video game. They're both really passionate about it. As a consequence of that, they never knew, by the way, as a consequence of that icebreaker, they arranged to play that game together that later evening. And there were other people in the team who liked video games as well. So it instantly became a bonding point. We started having backgrounds from video games as part of our team meetings and things like that. So it started to create a sense of community, an environment, a culture for what the team was like, because every team is a microculture. So I definitely encourage ice breaking. Again, there are so many resources out there to do so. I will share with you a few examples of some of the ones that I've done in my retrospectives. So we've got the Taco Tuesday retrospective, where I had everyone to build their perfect taco using little virtual images of tacos. There was a Shaun of the Dead, which is a zombie film. What's your zombie apocalypse plan? Share what you do. We had Journey, the rock band, and it was a bit of an ad-lib situation. So describe your last iteration based on the songs from the lyrics of the song. So we are just a small town software delivery team living in a X world. We took the blank going somewhere. You can do that. There are all sorts of ways of doing things. You can get people to describe their last iteration in terms of a dog meme. You could have it linked to topical or seasonal times of the year, like Halloween. What's your favorite thing about Halloween? I've got a cluster of Halloween themed retrospectives. So icebreakers can build a sense of community to the team. They can ensure that your team feels like a team rather than just a group of individuals. Now, there's a question here. Shu, Jen, Oliver, can you skip retrospectives? I mean, you can. I don't recommend it. There is a single ceremony, event, meeting, whatever you wish to call it, that I encourage all teams to partake in, and that's retrospection. The variable therein is the frequency that team needs to do those retrospectives. That will be dependent on their situation, their needs. I have found very mature teams, they don't need to do formal retrospectives every 2 weeks because they've just built retrospection and continuous improvement into their DNA. They ask in their daily stand-ups, how could we improve today? They keep a virtual space where they can add new backlog items or new ideas for improvement iteratively as they go along, rather than waiting a few weeks and then therefore their feedback loop is very long. One of the plays that I will come across to if we get to the foundation section is about the importance of retrospectives and what happens when we don't do them. But yeah, I don't encourage skipping retrospectives at all. Right, last one in this section is all around convergence and divergence. Again, this is very much built into how I facilitate all of my sessions, retrospectives or otherwise. So I've got an image here of liberating structures. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. My favorite of these are 1, 2, 4 all. But however, what I do is I'm doing a retrospective. I introduce a prompt, and let's use the example I used earlier. Don't stop me now, which basically means what should we continue doing as a team? What I'll do is I'll introduce that prompt. I will play the music in the background, so we're creating a bit of atmosphere, and I'll just allow 5 minutes or so for people just to get their thoughts down in silence, individually. I won't ask them to cover all of the questions or the prompts on the board, because that can be a bit chaotic, and I would rather do one prompt at a time, get an action out of it before moving on to the next one, because I'm sure some of you have faced this where you try and cover everything, and then the last part of the retrospective ends up focusing on what actions can we pull out, and then we cut short our time to get actions. So one prompt at a time, allow them 5 minutes or so to diverge, to think separately. I'm not sharing a screen, but let me share my screen. I am now. Yes, 5 minutes or so for them to diverge, think in silence. What that does is it allows quieter voices to get their thoughts down without any dominant voices, louder voices taking over and skewing the direction of that conversation. So we first allow those 5 minutes, and then I invite people to, as a group, create a consensus onto the most important things that need addressing. So let's say we had that prompt, don't stop me now, what should we continue doing? There might appear from that 10 items that people have thought of, ideas for what they should continue doing. I invite them to dot vote, and I usually do this with creative dot voting, so little pictures of Freddie Mercury rather than just dots. And they will then identify the most important thing to them that they want to address or continue doing, and from that pull an action. Obviously, you will allow people the opportunity to discuss if necessary, to clarify anything that isn't unclear. But what we're doing there is avoiding dominance hierarchies, avoiding dominant voices taking over, allowing everyone to get their thoughts down and expose those, allowing everyone a voice before coming to a group consensus, and then from that pulling an action or experiment that the team can try next in the future. So the consequence of that is, over the duration of a 45-minute retrospective, you should be getting 3 to 5 actions that the team are going to try next. So by allowing people to get their thoughts down individually before sharing with the group, we can allow those quieter voices to be heard and then come to a group consensus. So those are the tips I have for you on the facilitation side of things. Let me have a quick look and see what the next highest rated section was. By the looks of it, I think it's finishing up. So we're going to jump to there, and I'll bring everyone's attention to the finishing up section. Can everyone see where I am? Yes, okay, so retroception. This is what I call retroing the retro. Now, I firmly believe that nothing should be absolved from continuous improvement. So we need to continuously improve the way we run our retros also. You will see here, I've got a few examples. If I was to zoom right in, you've got a rate your retro system I invented. It's basically a bit of a fist of 5 type rating, 1 to 5. So at the end of the retro, you leave 5 minutes or so and you ask the team, right, how was that retro for you? And if it was a 1, you know, the lower end of the scale, maybe the retro took place, maybe some team members were missing, we might have identified some improvement items, but the time box might have run long. If it was a 5, well, everyone contributed without fear of judgment. So we had psychological safety. We respected the time box. We've identified action items with owners, and we've celebrated both successes and reflected on the challenges we face as well, with 3 being in the middle there somewhere. Now, if we invite the team to do that at the end of the retro and we're seeing a 3 on the scale on average, then we could be saying, okay, so what could we do differently in our next retro, which will make that even better? How could we enable people to speak out more openly without judgment? How could we respect the time box better? How could we reflect more on successes and failures, as well as just it being a negative experience? So you can basically invite the team to retro their retro, and again, develop action items in that. There are lots of ways of doing it. I've shared another example here. This is something that Steve Sampson Jones shared. His was a Harry Potter retrospective. So he did it on a scale of these Harry Potter items, and you just moved a wand to rate it on the scale as appropriate. So the question for you, again, I like to build an interaction. How do you personally ensure that retros you're facilitating are adding value to those involved? Again, share out loud, speak on the post, add on the post-it notes, or talk in the Zoom chat as appropriate. Yeah, so giving and receiving kudos, quarterly assessments. So yeah, you might use a health check or an assessment style on a periodic basis like quarterly, and use that as a way of measuring progress over time and value. Actions are followed through. So yeah, at the beginning of a new retro, you might be looking at the previous retro items and seeing, have we progressed on those? Asking the team, always a great answer. Ask the team, how do they think? Are they adding value? You don't necessarily have to have a rating system. You could just ask an open, honest question. How could this have been better? What would you like more or less of in this next retrospective? There are actionable items taken away. Yes. Ask the team. That's what I said. Ask the team. Celebrating success. Creating a safe space. Absolutely. So there's lots of ways there of measuring success. Right, next one then. We still have half hour left to cover some more tips and tricks for you. So starting small. Is anyone familiar with the story from Sky cycling team back in the early 2000s? How they turned themselves from essentially a relatively unknown team to one of the best in the world? No? So one of the things that they did, yes, I can see KMDS has added 1%. Right. So there was a new director that was brought in, a new performance director to the Sky cycling team. At the time, Britain had never won a Tour de France and was, again, relatively unknown. I think they won 1 gold medal. Now, what their performance director came in and did was he said, right, there are 100 variables or more involved in making a great cycling team. And rather than focusing on trying to make big step changes in something, he said, right, I want to try and make a 1% improvement in the way you recover. So we're going to make sure your sleep quality is improved by 1%. I want to ensure that your massages that you're getting, or the gels we use, are going to help you recover 1% better. We're going to do a 1% change in this bit of equipment, a 1% change in this training style. And the consequence of that, these small marginal gains over time amass to great results. So if a team becomes 1% better every day, by the end of a year, they'll be 37 times better. So it aggregates in a huge way, really rapidly. And again, the challenge with teams and retrospectives and continuous improvement is often we think of the big things, right? We're going to do this. And the problem is the retrospective actions themselves, they take time, they take capacity to deliver upon. But there's some things that you've got to work on, either as a side of desk thing or alongside the rest of the work the team has to do, that other backlog that's always growing and the other people asking for you to do things. So rather than focusing on making these large changes, the encouragement is to try and make a 1% improvement in this, 1% improvement in that. How could we make a 1% improvement to our velocity? How could we make a 1% reduction in our number of defects coming in? How could we make a 1% improvement in how the team feels morale-wise? And focus on these small changes that they can action, see the results from, and then move on to the next one. So again, it's a great ethos, the law of marginal gains, the power of tiny gains. It's referenced in the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. And there are various techniques. If anyone's unfamiliar with that book, there are various techniques that you can use to help your teams build habits that result in small gains. So things like habit stacking. Everyone tends to have habits. You wake up in the morning, the first thing you do often is maybe go to the bathroom, have a shower, go get some breakfast, have a coffee, read something, maybe check your phone. These are all habits that are stacked one after the other. You could do the same with your teams. You could say, right, we're doing a retrospective. The first thing we do after a retrospective is we make sure those improvements are added straight to the backlog. Once they're there, they're visible, they're transparent. We're not going to forget them, rather than those retrospectives where we talk about things and then nothing happens and we're talking about the same things in a few weeks' time anyway. So habit stacking is one approach. And then to build new habits, it talks about making things easier for the team to do. So a good example is, let's say you want to build a habit for reading more. And one of the ways to do that is to make reading a physical book more visible to you. So you place it on your pillow at night, meaning that before you get into bed, you have to physically remove it and it reminds you, I wanted to read. Or another example, I'm going to put on my gym clothes before I leave the office, or before I commit to sitting down on the sofa, so that I'm physically in it and I'm more inclined to do so. Make it easier. But on the flip side, make things more difficult. So if you want to remove a habit that isn't helping you achieve your goals, make it more difficult. So if you want to stop eating certain things in the evening, make it harder to reach, put up on a shelf so you actually physically have to get a chair and climb up there. That small act makes it more difficult to do so. So there's lots of ways you can do that. So again, a couple of, well, I'd love you to share with me, how do you think you could help your teams commit to smaller actions, those smaller marginal gains over time? And again, you should be here on the board. And KM has shared on the chat that they established a 1% award structure, which inspired everyone. So anyone submitting a 1% improvement and getting implemented got a free raffle. They drew it quarterly for a bigger prize and did an annual prize for a laptop. So yeah, establishing a reward structure, a collective mechanism that incentivizes making 1% changes is definitely a way of doing that. Link to the board is coming to your chat again now. Right, so people have shared, tell the sky story. That's a great way of trying to get people to commit to smaller actions. Making things visible, yeah, absolutely. Story splitting, so smaller chunks of work. Prompting them to share what could be improved. Adding actions to the backlog and then refining it, yeah. Smaller chunks. Again, so let's say you are working with a team that identifies some big items. A question you could ask is, or you might establish as a team rule, what would a 1% improvement in this look like? And you might establish a boundary. And you might say, right, if it's not achieving that, maybe we need to split it further. Okay, let's jump across to this one then. I think someone mentioned it earlier, so this is why I'm skipping to here. Action avoidance. So is anyone familiar with this behavior below? Someone asks, who wants change? And everyone puts their hand up. And then they ask, who wants to change? And nothing happens. Yeah, I'm seeing nodding. So I always say in this scenario that taking no action in itself is a decision. So if a team, a group of people are aware that something needs to change, they're not happy with a certain situation, if they do nothing about it, A, that's a decision in itself, but they're also acknowledging and collectively taking responsibility for the fact that that situation won't change. Unless you change a variable, you'll be complaining about that same situation in the future. So Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same things over and over and expecting different results. So people want to change, but they aren't taking responsibility for change, then it's not going to change. They're not going to be happy in the future. So how do we encourage people to commit to changing, to avoid this action avoidance situation? Well, again, you might build into a team charter or a team agreement, a collective responsibility for what good looks like in this respect. If we are that, transparently aware that we've seen things we're not happy with and nothing's changing, we're not doing anything about them, we're not stepping up and taking ownership for actions, then we are aware that we're going to be facing the same situations in the future. So often visibility is a big thing. And this is why I mentioned earlier, there's a bit of a timeline visual. If you can show on a timeline that across maybe, let's say 3 sprints, sprint 9, 10, and 11, we added these items to the backlog and we color coded them and said, these ones have been delivered and all of them are one color because they haven't been delivered. You can be saying, well, we've discussed improvements we'd like, we've done nothing about them. What are we going to do next? How could we change the situation in the future? Are we happy with discussing things and them not improving? So again, they are essentially taking a decision that they're not going to change. Now, I often describe that retrospectives tend to involve two types of actions. You've got the actions that the team have within their own sphere of influence to do something about. They can change, the small changes that they can do something about themselves, small changes to their process, things that maybe don't require systemic change or affect teams of teams or require structural changes outside of their sphere of influence. The second type is that latter type. It's the type of things that affect multiple teams. They're systemic change, systemic impediments that block not just their team's progress, but otherwise. And those are the types of things that often need escalating to other places. And this is where I tend to do retrospectives at scale to identify systemic impediments. So you might, as part of a town hall, I once did a snow day themed town hall where I turned up to the meeting dressed in skiing gear, goggles, a helmet and everything. And the visual on the board was snowing and skiing. And on the side of the mountain was lots of post-it notes cascading down. It was called the pain avalanche. And I said, right, what is one thing stopping you from, or what's causing you most pain with your work at the moment? That was a quick way of saying, where is everyone en masse struggling with? And then you can obviously categorize them. You can use affinity mapping and identify systemic impediment to progress. You can equally take any of the retrospective templates that I create, run them with 10 teams in parallel, get them to prioritize the most important things, pull them into a central location, and then you could agree as a group, a program, what actions or experiments you're going to try next to remove those systemic impediments. You could be doing Spotify style health checks at scale where you again do them with 10 teams in parallel. You as a consequence of that, you're seeing, we've got lots of red across easy to release and lots of red across support. So management, leadership, these are the areas of systemic impediments. What are you going to do to help? Abril, you can access my retrospective templates. I will share a link in the chat shortly. The mural board for the conference has the link to it as well, but it's www.thevirtualagilecoach.co.uk/retrospectives. Or retros, sorry. Rob, you've corrected me. Thanks. Right, I'm going to skip a little bit to foundations. I'm conscious of time. So, is anyone familiar with the retro prime directive? Please tell me you are. Yes, okay. So what you can see here is, again, another question for you, another scale. Are retrospectives typically the ones that you're involved with? Are they a cause for celebration or are they a blame game? Use the little post-it notes, drag and drop them on the mirror board to the scale that you have found in your experience what retrospectives are. Celebration and reflection, good. So at the moment we're edging more towards the celebration side, which is positive. The retro prime directive, if anyone is unfamiliar, does sound like it's from Star Trek. But what it does is, for me, it sets the context of a retrospective. It sets the context of continuous improvement towards unconditional positive regards. So what it does is it's a written paragraph, and it says, regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources they had available to them, and the situation at hand. Now, someone else has mentioned in the chat here, they show the retro prime directive in every meeting, and I do exactly the same. I build them into my own templates. And the reason I do that, as I said, is it sets the context for unconditional positive regard. We're not in this session, this meeting together, to blame anyone. We're not here to throw a grenade over the fence and say, you did that. We're not here to point fingers and say, I couldn't finish my part because you didn't finish yours. It's a great way, right at the beginning, to set that context. This is why we're here. We don't care what we discover. What we care about is what we can do better in the future. So it's really easy. Just grab that visual, that retro prime directive, share it at the beginning. You can either read it out yourself. You can invite on a rotational basis for others to read it out. So it becomes, again, a collective responsibility for setting that context. But the key for me is this unconditional positive regards is also key to psychological safety, creating an environment where people feel safe to speak out because they aren't going to be afraid of judgment. I once worked with a client in the automotive industry, and whenever I start with a new client, I often interview and just have conversations with people at all levels of the organization, everyone from the tester working with the teams to the CTO who manages all those testers. And one of the things I discovered with this client was that they tried retrospectives before and they weren't working very well. People had stopped turning up to retrospectives because they didn't believe things were going to change, and they were a huge blame game. So one of the first things that I began introducing was the retrospective prime directive. This is why we're here. This is the context. And I wanted people to start to feel safe to do so. And again, one of my favorite anecdotes I love telling, the consequence of not just the retrospective prime directive, but introducing agility and greater psychological safety, was that one of those testers, a guy called Dalton, who had aspirations to be a scrum master, at their Christmas party, he'd had a few beers, he came up and he hugged me. He had previously said he wanted to leave the company, and now he was seeing change and it was positive. He was reconsidering that decision. So yeah, psychological safety, I think it's a huge buzzword nowadays. I will say many people mistake it and think, oh, if I tell people they have psychological safety, they'll have psychological safety, or they'll feel psychologically safe. I disagree. Psychological safety is built by repetitive demonstration that people are psychologically safe to fail, to make mistakes, to experiment. And with that in mind, I'm going to introduce you to the Failure Fest, which is another method for creating psychological safety. So, has anyone ever run a Failure Fest before? I'm seeing head shaking. We are now here on the boards. So I will say this one, it's a bit difficult. You'll require a high lot of psychological safety to do this. But what it does is it begins to destigmatize failure, right? So first question I have, what does failure mean to you? Share on these post-it notes here. Or again, speak aloud, type in the Zoom chat, however you prefer. What does failure mean to you? A door opening to another opportunity, the opposite of success. It's trying something, it's learning something, yes. That's what I consider. Personally, my definition of failure is a learning opportunity. I am myself, I'm a collection of scars, bruises, errors, mistakes, failures. I once failed my GCSEs, it hasn't stopped me being successful. Everyone makes mistakes. The problem is failure as a concept is stigmatized. We don't talk about it enough. And when we don't talk about things, we're deemed to repeat history. So what can you do to destigmatize failure? Well, you can celebrate it. One of my favorite stories about celebrating failure, and one that I feel has done more work to introduce an environment of psychological safety than I've ever seen, was I was once working for a client. It was an enterprise ERP system being put in for a global security company. And there was someone, we had really tight deadlines we were working to because it was Agile / waterfall type commercials, and everyone was up against it. And one day the environment, the database just went down and no one knew why. And there was panic and there was war rooms being established. And it got to 4 o'clock in the day and someone sent an email to the leadership team saying, I did that, I broke it, I'm sorry. Now, the response from the leadership team to that admission, that brave, courageous email being sent was, thank you, don't worry, we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, that single act, as I said, did more than I've ever seen to create psychological safety, because it demonstrated en masse that it's okay to make mistakes. We don't care what happens, we just want to ensure it doesn't happen again. So failure is a feedback opportunity. Failure is a learning. Now, what a failure fest is quite simply a meeting where you celebrate failure. And the way it works, let's say we were celebrating failure right now. We were doing a failure fest. The intention behind a failure fest is to learn from others' mistakes. So what you would do, a bit like the traditional Alcoholics Anonymous situation where someone stands up and says, hi, and introduce their name, and then they say what's happened. You say, hi, I'm Chris and I failed. And then everyone claps or smiles or cheers. They celebrate the fact that you failed. Then that person would explain what happened, what the failure was, and what they learned from it. Very simple. That's all it takes. And by doing that, you basically cross-pollinate failure stories across groups. You could do a Failure Fest retrospective. You could do a Failure Fest as part of a town hall meeting. You could do a Failure Fest as part of a product increment if you're using scaled Agile every quarter as a group-wide retrospective event. But what it does is it demonstrates it's okay to fail. It begins to destigmatize failure, which can result in people doing more experiments and more innovation coming as a consequence. So very much encourage experimenting with failure. I believe I am out of time, so I'm going to bring everyone's attention right to the last part, because it wouldn't be me without introducing an element of retrospection to this workshop itself. So what you'll see here is a bit of a line. On the bottom side is the worst ever return on your time invested. At the top right-hand side is the best ever. You can grab any of these post-it notes, you can drag it onto that scale, add any comments, anything you could think it could be better, anything you'd like more or less of. I am very, very thick-skinned, so if it was awful, tell me, I will improve upon it. But I'm trying to build in and practice and live and breathe what I'm preaching here about retrospection by building into my workshop. And then a little bit further down, you've also got some available resources. So there are links to my LinkedIn and my book, which I've already included in the Zoom chat. There's a link to buy my book, which is all about retrospection, alongside links to where you can access all of these 80+ retro templates and my YouTube channel as well. Other than that, thank you very much for interacting with me and workshopping with me. It's been a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
So it looks like we got about a little over 10 minutes between now and our next presenter. Anu Gopal will be presenting in about 12 minutes. So feel free to drop any comments, questions into the chat. Looking forward to this book coming out, Chris. I'm excited for it. Congratulations.
Thank you. Again, I'm sharing the link to that in the Zoom chat now.
I know I was trying to find it, but yeah, if you already beat me to it, perfect. Thank you.
There it is. I'm just going to share a link to the Slack channel now. It's if anyone's interested. Someone in the chat asked for it. So Tom, in answer to your question, just because we've got some time before the next session, if you're facing a team that maybe has had a bad experience of retrospectives and they're a bit anti-exercise, one of the things I would recommend is building a retro with them. So if you're familiar with the film Field of Dreams, I call this the Field of Dreams play. So the Field of Dreams is basically a film about creating a baseball park. And the famous quote from it is, "Build it and they will come." So if you invite your team to be part of the retrospective process and say, right, what retro could we create together? And I do tend to facilitate separate workshops about how to create engaging retrospectives. If you invite them to decide what a good retrospective looks like, what questions might help them improve, then they're more likely to be part of that change and there'd be less resistance to it. So you can grab any blank retro template that I've got out there and ask the team what prompts would make sense for you, what would work for you, rather than it being a very stale one, but also not something that's a bit too jazzy and maybe the one they've had a bad experience with. So hopefully that works. Yeah. In terms of my book, Kindle is the first release of the formats. I intend to deliver my book iteratively using Agile. So first release is going to be a digital copy, and then I'm going to get a publisher and produce a physical copy. There have been a bunch of people asking for signed copies and things like that. So I need to get a physical copy done, but that's probably going to be an early next year situation, given editing and setting up publishers and things. Right. Thanks for the invite to be part of the conference. Enjoy the rest of it, folks.
Thank you, Chris. All right, everybody, take a little break. We have about 7 minutes until our next presenter. A new Gopal will be up in about 7 minutes. So let's take a little breather and see you in 5.